much of this work is basically focusing on how we use socioeconomic data to really guide fisheries management. It's much of the genesis has to do leading back to the old TIP and LRS data. We have actually built on it and convert a lot of that information into an access database. With respect to background, most of you would recognize that fisheries governance is a complex thing in the context of small-scale fisheries, in which you have to look at various factors, whether it be social, economical, legal, political, and even cultural aspects. For instance, in Antigua, you might have a preference for, when you're buying fish for a whole fish as opposed to the Windward Island, but that is related to the resources in which you have. The demersal species tend to be much smaller, so you have this preference for a whole fish as opposed to a steak. Now, when I say fisheries systems, I'm actually talking about the complex interaction among human and non-human factors. Often, the focus is more on the assessment of the fisheries resource. For instance, I remember in the past just seeing Robin Mahone yesterday. He had written a paper looking at, for instance, that fisheries management need to be more management objective driven as opposed to stock assessment driven. And that has been my mantra for years in approaching fisheries management. At the end of the day, the human factors is basically what drive fishing effort. The objectives basically were to update the socioeconomic profile of fishes in Antigua with respect to the national registry as well as licensing program. We have moved to a licensing system. The genesis behind that has to do with getting up-to-date information on the human element of the entire fishery system. So we focus on factors such as age, sex, role in fisheries, educational background, number of dependents, financial dependents. In addition to that, it was also recognized that to have a proper picture that is recent, much of us would realize that fisheries is dynamic. By having a licensing system, we are able to get information on what's actually taking place now, as opposed to depending on the socioeconomic information in the registry. Fishers tend to move in and out of fisheries because it tends to be a vital complement to other economic activities. I'll jump directly into the information in terms of age. As far back as 2002, we had this issue in terms of the graying of the fishery sector, the graying of the population. At that time, the actual median age was in the ballpark of roughly between 35 and 39 years of age. Using the current information from the active fishers, that situation is actually worse. In that now, in 2002, fishers under 35 years comprise 20% of the population. In 2019, it's only 15%. Now, if you look at the population pyramid, given that the fisheries has potential for development in other areas, we would rather have an expansive base to support future development. What we have here is a population pyramid in which you would probably like to have, if for instance your fisheries was operating at its maximum sustainable yield, and you wanted very few young entrants, to actually maintain the population. With respect to sex, female fishers accounted for 5.9% of the active fishers in 2019, and that was slightly above information from the actual registry, which was 4.2%. Hence, there were actually significant gains in terms of females entering the sector, because when we look back to data dating far back to, say, for instance, in the early late 1990s, you would have had like female fishers accounting for 2% of the population. So we have had some improvement in that area, but it's still far from where we'd like to be in terms of having female participation in the sector. Follow-up questions with the sampled fishers, they indicate, for instance, family history, experience in fishing, inheritance of an asset, were actually the main entry point for females into the sector. Or the issues that they mentioned that were barriers, particularly if your parents weren't involved in fishing, the issue of, say, for instance, the security above a fishing vessel, the security on a fishing vessel in the context of this male-dominated sector. With respect to employment, of the 219 active fishers, 52% had another source of income or occupation. If you look on the figure, somewhere the areas that used to be the primary areas of alternative occupation would have been, in the past, would have been agriculture, construction. A lot of that has actually changed. We have a substantial proportion from other sectors that are actually participating in the fishery sector as a complement to their other means of income. Now, there are very few papers looking at occupational tourism in the sector, but most fishers tend to have not only a diverse source of income, but where they also tend to vertically integrate their business. For instance, you may operate a boat, but you may also have a fish shop, or you may have a restaurant. So that is very common within the sector. So roughly a half of the fishers have a somewhat robust degree of financial resilience and adaptive capacity. Now, it suggests, the information suggesting that, but then when you look at other things, say for instance, insurance in the sector, in the case of Antigua and Barbuda, roughly 66% of the vessels were insured in 2017. So when you take climate change into consideration, the impacts of hurricane, you realize this can change in a second. With respect to formal education, there have been major increase in terms of educational attainment. When I entered fisheries, at most 43% had attained a secondary school or higher. And that was way back in the around 1999. And now 77% of fishers attain a secondary school education or higher. Now, this is a good thing because you have occupational mobility, the capacity to change occupation, and your adaptive capacity, for instance, to respond to economic stress. There are more options available for you. As I think Peter might have mentioned during the presentation with respect to gender, again, we have the issue in terms of female fishers were more formally educated than their male counterparts. 85% versus 77% having a secondary school education or higher. So again, you have this dynamic at play. And in terms of future work, we recognize that fisheries is a safety net in times of economic crisis. When we had the COVID lockdown, we had roughly about 260% increase in the number of persons renewing their license or registering a license for the first time. That may be fine to actually support individuals in times of economic crisis, but that creates another issue, the issue of sustainability. For instance, if you have a resource and it's already stressed to the max, you would not want new entry. Luckily, in our case, we had a limited entry management regime in 2013, so individuals that were actually entering the sector at this time had to, only certain areas were available for them to participate. Again, a lot of times we don't make the connection between the actual labor market dynamics of fisheries, how fisheries relate to tourism, how fisheries relate to the other sectors. We tend to analyze fisheries in a box. but the individuals are moving in and out and between sectors.
Well, thank you, Mr. Horsford. That was actually perfectly timed.